Hail now to Augustus Caesar, Pharaoh and God of Egypt. Behold him like an ancient Pharaoh, holding in his hand an image of Maat, the symbol of truth and justice, and wearing the headdress of Horus, god of the rising sun. For Egypt now belonged to Rome, and as emperor of Rome, Augustus Caesar was also ruler or Pharaoh of Egypt. In this August of 12 BC, just 18 years had passed since that morning in another August, when Cleopatra had fled in terror to her tomb near the temple of Isis. Antony had died in her arms, and young Octavian had entered Alexandria as conqueror of Egypt and master of the Roman world. It was most natural for Egypt's new ruler to be regarded as a god, just as Egypt's pharaohs had always been, and also pictured as Horus, god of the rising sun. As Horus, Augustus was portrayed as adoring the Holy Mother Isis, with whom Cleopatra had been identified. Both belong to Egypt's most sacred myth, the strange but beautiful story of Osiris, the most beloved god of the Egyptian people, one who had died and risen to new life again. According to the legend, the god Osiris had lived and ruled in Egypt as a king, a good king, fair and just, and beautiful as a palm tree, or as fields of wheat growing by the Nile. Isis, his wife, was also fair and beautiful, but he had a wicked brother by the name of Set, who was all darkness and evil. Set plotted against his good brother and killed him, just as the darkness of winter kills the green things of the earth. And Set put the body of Osiris in a coffin and threw it into the Nile, and it floated off to sea. Isis, the loving wife of Osiris, was heartbroken. Weeping bitterly, she set forth and searched the whole world over for the dead body of her husband. At last, on the shore of Syria, she found the coffin cast up by the waves, and from it a small green tree was growing. Isis carried the coffin back to Egypt and hid it. But Set, the wicked one, found the dead body of Osiris and hacked it into 14 pieces. And he scattered them hither and yon. Over valley and desert the faithful Isis searched yet again, until she had found the pieces and buried them. And then Horus was born, her child and son of the dead Osiris. Isis hid the newborn son in the rushes by the Nile. There she raised him, nursing him tenderly while he was weak and feeble like the rays of the winter sun, until he was strong enough to contend with his wicked uncle. Then, grown to young manhood, Horus rose in all his power and conquered the evil Set, just as the warm spring sun rising above the rushes of the Nile conquered the darkness of winter. And as the warm rays of the spring sun also brought forth to new life the vegetation of the earth, so also Horus raised his father Osiris from the winter of death. And Osiris, the good king, lived again. But from then on, he ruled and judged not on earth, but in the kingdom of the dead which lay somewhere beneath the earth, which seemed to hold within it the seeds of eternal life. There, in that shadowy land below the horizon, into which the sun sank each night and rose again each morning, the souls of the dead came before Osiris to be judged. For death must come to all men. But if, like Osiris, they have been good and true in their life on earth, they too will pass through death into a new life. The Egyptian Book of the Dead portrays a judgment scene. Osiris, Lord of Truth, judges a person who has just died. The newly dead hails Osiris with, "Hail to thee, great God, Lord of Truth! I have come to thee, my Lord, led hither in order to see thy beauty. Behold, I bring to thee righteousness. Meanwhile, in a jar on a set of scales, his soul is being balanced against the image of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice, who herself is standing facing him as he enters the judgment hall. Horus, with his falcon head, is there beneath the scale. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, is the god of embalming, who superintends the great care given to preserve the body of the dead. The ibis-headed god Thoth writes down the record of the man's life on earth. There were 42 commandments which a truly righteous Egyptian must keep. Into these the dead person now swears to the assembled gods that he has been true. I have not done evil in place of truth. I allowed no one to hunger. I caused no one to weep. I did not murder. I did not commit adultery. I did not steal. I did not revile the king. I did not blaspheme the God. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, and a ferry to him who was without a boat. I made divine offerings to the gods and food offerings to the dead. Save me, protect me, gods who are in the hall of truth. Enter no complaint against me before the great god Osiris. How old this sacred story of Osiris may be, no one knows. It must have been told long before the Egyptians began to write, for originally Osiris was the Nile River. The life-giving Nile and the glorious sun were Egypt's earliest gods. Back in that dim past, when the Egyptians had been only hunters, roaming and paddling through the reedy marshes, the sun that rose each day, warm and glorious above the river, had seemed to them to be all-powerful, and they took it for a god. Their word for sun was Ra, and they imagined Ra as a hunter like themselves, paddling himself across the river of heaven in a boat of reeds. In time, these wandering Egyptian hunters settled down and began to cultivate the fields of wheat and barley in the valley of the Nile. Then the great river which flooded and enriched the earth at the beginning of each season seemed also to have the power of a god. Life came from the Nile and from the sun. Together they made the bare fields of winter green again with new life. Now each morning, as they saw the sun Ra rising up from the horizon over their level fields of grain, the Egyptian farmers thought of him as a golden falcon or hawk, soaring with widespread wings on his daily flight across the heavens. So they began to picture Ra with wings, then as a falcon, or as a man with the head of a falcon, and to call him Ra-Hor-Akht, son of the horizon, or merely Horus, god of the rising sun. The earliest pharaohs took on the hawk of Horus as their symbol, and the principal festival in early times was the worship of Horus. It was centered in an old city known as On. There stood a great temple to the sun. It was before that temple that Joseph and his brethren and their father Jacob must have walked. For it was there in On that Joseph served as overseer in the house of the Pharaoh, and took as his wife one of the daughters of the priest of the temple. It was there, too, that young Moses learned the wisdom of the Egyptians, long before he led his people out of Egypt and gave them the 10 Commandments. About 100 years before Moses was born, one of the pharaohs set up before the temple of the sun tall obelisks of reddish granite, long pointed shafts of stone, resembling the rays of sunlight. Now that the Romans had taken over Egypt, 2 of these obelisks had been moved away from the old city of the sun, where they had stood for centuries. Roman engineers had them hauled up the Nile to Alexandria. and by order of Augustus Caesar, they had been erected before the entrance to his newly completed palace or temple, one which Cleopatra had started to build for Antony. Today, although these old obelisks belong to a far earlier age than that of Cleopatra, we call them Cleopatra's Needles, for they are still standing today, but not in Egypt. Less than 100 years ago, they were moved from Alexandria. One was taken to London and one to Central Park in New York City. And those two old obelisks, how many centuries have passed over them? And yet for centuries before they were ever erected, when the people of Europe were in the Stone Age, and the Jews were but half-savage shepherds of the desert, the Egyptians had been highly civilized. They had commandments to teach justice, goodwill, and peaceful living. They were also telling a parable of eternal life, believing that in the end, life and truth and goodness must triumph over evil and death. It was there, too, in ancient Egypt, that another great truth was first conceived and taught: the idea of one God.